Pippa Jones on TRE.
Well, let's get started with perhaps the main news story that's going out across the world today, and that being, of course, the news coming out of Aleppo saying that the Syrian army has actually retaken full control of Aleppo. Well, this is news that hit last night, but I had already arranged for my next guest to be live with me today, and the reason I'd asked him on is because he can provide us with a certain perspective of the news that comes out of Syria and the wider world, I have to add, because of course it's not just about Syria, in a way that we don't usually expect to hear by the mainstream media. He is published editor of Politics First, and he is the wonderful Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Good morning, Marcus.
Good morning, Pippa, and thank you very much for having invited me onto your programme.
It's our pleasure to listen to you. A very interesting perspective, and I suppose we have to start most recently and then perhaps work our way back. We see now that many are celebrating, including Bashar Assad, that Aleppo has been taken back.
Yes, hundreds of thousands of people in Aleppo are celebrating the liberation of Aleppo, because for 4 years the people in Aleppo, both in the western part, which was controlled by the Syrian army, and also in the eastern part, which of course was controlled by Islamist terrorists, have been very much on the front line of this dreadful conflict. And people in East Aleppo for the last 4 years have suffered immeasurably. They have been tormented by their captors. They have been murdered en masse. They have been imprisoned en masse, and they have been prevented from celebrating Christmas. And I say that because, of course, Christmas is only a few days away now. So the people of Aleppo in the eastern part and in the western part are rejoicing. They're rejoicing in the liberation of their city. And they understand very well that the Syrian army, their soldiers, their men and women have achieved a spectacular victory. And the hope now of the people of Aleppo is that this victory will spur the Syrian army on to liberate more and more of Syrian soil.
Now, of course, that's welcome news, and yet it does feel, to a layperson like me, I'm very confused to understand what it actually means on the ground, and why it is that so many can be celebrating when actually so many have been displaced over this last week because of the evacuation. Of course, they're happy to get away from the fear and the terror that they were surrounded by. But the fact is they're displaced now. It's very cold. It's winter time. They've got nowhere to go.
Well, of course, war is a terrible, terrible thing. And, there can only be bittersweet victories at a time of war. But there's no question about it that even though the people of East Aleppo are still suffering to this day, despite having been liberated, they're suffering in that there is barely any electricity, any gas, any heating. There are food shortages. And of course, many of them have had to leave their homes in the last few weeks while the Syrian military was prosecuting its campaign to liberate East Aleppo. The reality is that things will, albeit slowly, will become better for those people, because, as I said, those people were prisoners. They were prisoners in their own city, in their own homes, by some of the most repugnant people in the history of mankind. And I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but that's what those people, those Islamist terrorists who were their captors, can be described as. And it is so important for people listening to this discussion, to this interview, to understand that the West, the American and British governments and their regional allies, the Turks, the Saudi Arabians and the Qataris, have been absolutely critical in their support for Islamist terrorists, not just in East Aleppo, but all across Syria as well. They have caused this conflict. They have caused this suffering. And yes, while the Syrian military and the Russian military were carrying out their campaign to liberate East Aleppo, Were there civilian casualties? Yes, there were. That was not the intention of the Syrian military or the Russian military. It is a terrible, terrible fact of war that civilians will be harmed. They will be killed or they will be maimed. And that is unbelievably regrettable. But what is the alternative? Do you just leave Islamist terrorists in control of a major part of a major city in Syria? No, the reality is that you have to liberate that part which is controlled by terrorists. And the reality is that every terrorist that the Syrian army neutralizes in Syria means that the threat posed to Western Europe, to Britain in particular, decreases. Because let's be very clear about it, that the people who the Syrian military are fighting against 24/7 in Syria are the same people, ideologically speaking, who carried out the London bombings in July 2005 and who want to replicate those bombings up and down Britain.
There's no question, I think, even though the mainstream media will obviously not make that connection, but I think that information has managed to filter down to the public consciousness now, and many are aware that here we have an issue of those very same people being implicated, even if it's just in stirring up the information which allows lone wolves or whatever it is to carry out an atrocity on European soil. There is undoubtedly a link. The bigger picture, of course, is that the Assad regime has had continual backing from Russia, Iran, from the sort of Shiite factions, from Hezbollah, and their success can be attributed in no small part to the backing of those that I've just mentioned. So essentially, Marcus, are we looking here at a sort of victory over the West, a victory over Saudi Arabia, over US, over the Western backing of these rebels?
Can I first of all very quickly say that it is the Syrian government, not the Syrian regime. The expression Syrian regime is very much from the lexicon of the Western government.
I've been brainwashed too. I do watch that stuff. I apologise.
And also as well, it is the Syrian army. What we hear in Washington and London are references to Assad's army. No, it's the Syrian Arab army. It is comprised of all the different groups in Syria, from Sunni to Shia to Christian to Druze to Armenian to Kurd, etc., etc. The victory in Aleppo is a victory first and foremost for Syria, for the Syrian people, for the multicultural secular state that is Syria. That is absolutely crucial. That is absolutely imperative to state that. And I did mention a few moments ago that Christmas, of course, is fast approaching. And where will we see President Assad on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day? We will see him in the churches and the monasteries. Now, of course, President Assad is an Alawite. He's a secular Muslim. But there you go, a secular Muslim. He represents the multicultural state that is Syria, and you will find him in the churches and the monasteries, as I said, at Christmas time. Now, you would never find a Saudi king in a church or a monastery. But, of course, as I said, it's a victory for the Syrian people. But after that, yes, it is a victory against the backers of the Islamist terrorists in Aleppo and in Syria in general, because, as I said, the West, the Americans and the British and the Turks and the Saudis and the Qataris, they have armed to the teeth these terrorists in Syria. They have given them logistical assistance. They have given them intelligence. They have given them money. Turkey under Erdogan, who of course is an Islamist leader, has turned his own country into a vast training camp, into a vast network for Islamists and jihadists to use and then to cross to and from into Syria. So that is why there is uproar in Washington and London and Riyadh and Ankara about the victory in Aleppo, because their proxies have been defeated. They have lost a major battle. A lot of commentators are referring to the victory at Aleppo as the turning point. Well, I would say the turning point in the conflict in Syria was in September 2015 when the Russian military entered the conflict. I would say the victory at Aleppo is the breaking point. And I think that the West and their regional allies now understand clearly that the Syrian government, that President Assad, is not going to fall. He's not going to be overthrown, because that is not what the Syrian people want, and the Russian military is certainly not going to allow that to happen. And they are bitter. They are bitter because they wanted to overthrow the Syrian government, because by overthrowing the Syrian government, the Americans know that Russia's influence and power in the Middle East would go, because Russia and Syria have been very, very close friends for over 50 years. And by Syria collapsing, and with Islamist pro-Western government being imposed in Damascus, that would cement America's dominance of the Middle East. Now, that's not going to happen. And that is why the Americans and their allies are so bitter, are irate over what has happened in Aleppo, because they know that the objective they have been pursuing since 2011 has failed, and has failed abysmally.
Marcus, I must bring our attention to something that you said a couple of months ago, actually, and that was around some comments that Boris Johnson made. We're talking here, we've just mentioned Erdogan, of course, we're talking about Putin and Russia's involvement. And, of course, just a few days ago, we saw the assassination of the Russian envoy by a security person in Turkey who shot the gentleman at close range in the back. Now, you actually said, in response to Boris Johnson's comments some 2 months ago, when Boris Johnson mentioned that people should perhaps be protesting outside Russian embassy about Russia's involvement in Syria, you actually said there and then, you said this kind of rhetoric, and I'm not quoting you because I can't remember your much more eloquent words, but you said something along the lines of, this rhetoric is the kind of rhetoric which causes hatred and hostility towards diplomats, in this case Russian diplomats, which could put their lives and that of their families in danger. Just 2 days ago, we saw that very danger carried out. Yes.
Well, Boris Johnson, of course, is a maverick. He's not a serious, credible politician, and he should not be holding the position of Foreign Secretary. When he called for protests outside the Russian embassy back in October, that contravened all diplomatic norms. No foreign minister, or foreign secretary in his case, should encourage protests outside an embassy or a high commission in Britain, because, as I said, that is completely at odds with diplomatic norms. But also, of course, that can encourage hatred. That can legitimize, in someone's mind, taking action against a Russian diplomat, because people in Britain are engulfed on a daily basis with this terrible hatred, this terrible demonization of Russia by British politicians and British mainstream journalists. And all you require is, to use that expression, a lone wolf to be sitting at home. And they have become embedded with this loathing of Russia, because they believe that Russia is killing children and bombing hospitals in Aleppo, which of course they're not, but that's what they're hearing from the British government and the British media. And then they hear Boris Johnson say, come outside the Russian embassy and protest. Now, in someone's mind, someone who is perhaps of an unsound disposition, that could legitimize, in their mind, taking action taking the law into their own hands and harming a Russian diplomat. And of course, people around the world heard what Boris Johnson said. Now, this week, of course, we had the vile, appalling murder of the Russian ambassador in Turkey. And the point is this: is that ambassadors are not politicians. They are diplomats. They are there to follow out, to fulfill the instructions of their respective governments. They're there to act as a channel of communication between their government and the government in the country which they find themselves in. And Boris Johnson's comment, of course, put the Russian embassy in the firing range of a lot of very dangerous people, because in effect what he was saying is that the Russian embassy in London is guilty of war crimes in Aleppo. They're guilty of killing children in Aleppo and destroying hospitals in Aleppo, and we need to show condemnation of this by creating groups of protesters outside. Well, that's a very dangerous comment to come out with. That's exceptionally reckless, and in my estimation, I believe that indirectly Boris Johnson can be responsible or is partly responsible for the terrible events this week when the Russian ambassador was murdered in Turkey.
I did have to think back to your words, actually, when I saw that. I remembered what you'd said. Let me ask you, if I may, Marcus, regarding the situation as we see it at the moment. You know, clearly, even those who might have been the most anti-Assad may well believe now that keeping Assad in place is perhaps, you know, one of the best options. We've seen the destabilization of many countries in the Middle East and what it can lead to. And I have to refer to a particular Syrian person that I know, who's out of Syria now and living in London, Hassan Akkad, who has spoken very eloquently about when his own experience when the Arab Spring rising started to be infected around the Middle East, and people in Syria decided it was time to change, and they went out on the street. And his own treatment, he was a teacher in Aleppo, but his own treatment at the hands of Assad's security forces, who brutalised him, frankly, terribly brutalised him. Long story short, the man made a journey which was covered by the BBC, Exodus, and he now lives in London. But he, for one, believes that Assad is an evil man who should have no place in ruling that country.
Well, of course, I don't know about this specific gentleman, but what I would say is this. When the uprising in Syria began, was it handled perfectly by the Syrian government? No, it wasn't. Mistakes were made. And indeed, governments across the world, they make mistakes, and they make mistakes on a daily basis. What is very important to emphasize, however, is that the protests that emerged in Syria were not actually widespread, and they were far from being peaceful, as is how they are portrayed by Western media. In fact, on the first day, and on the second day, and on the third day of the protests, military people and members of the police force were abducted by these so-called peaceful protesters, were murdered, and their bodies were mutilated. And it was very clear at that time that many of those protesters were, of course, Islamists. Now, as I said, did the Syrian government handle the protests perfectly well? No, they did not. Were some protesters who were peaceful? And, of course, there were some who were peaceful. Were they treated in some cases poorly by members of the police force? Undoubtedly they were. But the point is this: overall, those protests were not peaceful, they were violent, and they were Islamist inspired from the very beginning. Yes, there are some Syrians who do want political reform in Syria, but those protesters have made it very clear that they do not want the Syrian state, the multicultural secular state, overthrown, and they want to work with the domestic opposition parties in Syria to bring about those reforms. These people are very, very different to the so-called opposition parties, so-called Syrian opposition parties, which reside, for example, in Turkey and in Saudi Arabia, because these people are Islamists. These people want the secular, multicultural state that is Syria destroyed. These are not Syrian patriots. These are people who have their own agenda, and they are following the orders of Ankara and Riyadh to bring about an Islamist regime in Syria. And quite frankly, they were never going to succeed, and they will not succeed. Why? Because the vast majority of Syrians, actively or passively, they support the Syrian government, they support President Assad, and they are secular people, and they have no time for Islamists, and they have no time for these, as I say, so-called political parties which reside in Ankara and which reside in Riyadh. And these people have the blood of Syrians on their hands because they are working in tandem with the Turkish and the Saudi governments, who have brought about so much bloodshed in Syria that it is untrue.
Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who you can actually find out more and follow him on Twitter at Dr. Marcus P. Particularly, there is a link to a speech that he gave at the House of Lords about the tension between the US and Russia, as seen by Marcus Papadopoulos, who you've been listening to now. Dr. Papadopoulos, thank you very much. Have a wonderful Christmas, and I hope we can speak in the new year.
Thank you very much, and have a lovely Christmas yourself too.
Thank you, Marcus. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This is Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain.